yeah, like I said, this is a presentation that I gave at DevCon, and I think we can just go through it and pause for questions when it makes sense. But yeah, like Deacon mentioned, this is core protocol funding organization. He used the term DAO. We actually don't use that term anywhere in the docs, not because we don't like it. We love DAOs, but because people have so many different associations with it. So if it's helpful for you to think of this as a DAO, that's totally fine. And then I guess just wanted to give a shout out to everybody showing up in the bear market to talk about and build on-chain coordination mechanisms like this. This is the exciting time, and just kudos to everybody for sticking around even when the hype may have left the market. But this is when the interesting discussions and projects happen, is in the bear market. So give yourself a pat on the back. Okay, so funding Ethereum with the Protocol Guild. So I work at the Ethereum Foundation. Tim does as well. We do network coordination around protocol upgrades, like for example the merge. But in this context, I'll be presenting as a member of the Protocol Guild itself. So let's zoom out really, really far and just set everybody in the same context about Ethereum and its public goods. So really broadly, Ethereum, the network, is a globally distributed computer anyone can use. This includes, like I said, the network itself, so where you're sending transactions, but also the Ethereum virtual machine. This is what people would call the EVM. Many other chains besides Ethereum mainnet use the Ethereum virtual machine in a whole variety of places. And then there's the entire tooling layer that builds off the EVM. We can call both of these things, the mainnet itself and the virtual machine, public goods that a lot of the broader ecosystem depend on. Stretching the definition of public goods a little bit because obviously you have to pay gas fees, but we're hoping to scale this to mass ubiquity around the world so anybody can use it at a pretty accessible and affordable rate. Yeah. So this public good itself is funded in a couple, or not funded, but it's maintained in a couple different ways. Research, clients, coordination, like the work that Tim and I do, and then, like I said, the tooling that enables people to actually engage with this. So Solidity language, Viper, all of the dev tooling that actually helps people construct smart contracts, things like this. And like we said at the beginning, if people, this will be sort of a presentation / discussion. So if there's something like a brief comment you want to jump in or clarify something, feel free, and then we'll have bigger space for discussion at the end. With that understanding that Ethereum, the network, the EVM are public goods, who funds them? So we've got probably front of mind is the Ethereum Foundation. Spend tens of millions each year doing a whole bunch of different funding mechanisms, grant rounds. They have put together something like called the Client Incentive Program, which gives a chunk of ETH to people who develop the client software itself and allows them to run validators, participate in proof of stake. In 2021, the EF coordinated these grants from different bits of the application layer in 2021. And then just generally the Ethereum Foundation pays a lot of salaries for people to focus full time on this important core protocol stuff. Probably know the EF. And then outside of it, some other names you might be familiar with. Optimism has committed to running retroactive public goods funding rounds. They ran one and they're planning to do another one soon. Again, focused on people who are developing infrastructure or tooling that otherwise wouldn't be maintained without the support of the retroactive funding round. There's Giveth, Gitcoin, CLR Fund, Open Grants, and near and dear to everyone's heart, Moloch DAO. All of these organizations fund public goods in some way, and they have done this for years now, and that's really awesome to see that there are so many different mechanisms. In a few different ways, it decentralizes power and influence. It reminds us of our agency as individuals when we engage with them and help to fund different bits of the ecosystem. Helps us celebrate pluralism, a bunch of different benefits. So yeah, this is a good thing to have many different approaches, many different mechanisms. However, over the years and through some experimentation, it's sort of settled on a few similar curation techniques. Gitcoin Grants uses quadratic funding. Optimism has started using a sort of a council to curate which funds should be eligible or which projects should be eligible for the retroactive rounds. The EF uses a team called the Ecosystem Support Program, the ESP, where they curate grants, give them feedback, decide whether it's funding. So, but largely out in the ecosystem, people are focused on quadratic funding. The main challenge of quadratic funding is that the people who are getting funded may not necessarily be doing the curation. So there can sometimes be this mismatch between which grants are getting attention and which ones really need funding itself. So this, like I said, opens up the question of like, what are better ways to curate? And specifically, if we're going to drill in, how can we incentivize long-term core protocol contributions? Because that's, again, where I'm approaching this from. I've been working with or adjacent to the core protocol for a couple of years now. And I have some perspectives, and Tim does as well. He's running all core devs calls and just coordinating between all the client teams, helping run network upgrades. And this is one of the things we came across. So around November of last year, a group of core contributors started thinking about what challenges we want to address if we were to design a bespoke core protocol funding mechanism. We want to push the envelope on pushing the protocol to new directions, trying to scale, trying to make it censorship resistant. We're pushing the envelope technically. I think it's also important to be pushing the envelope on the governance front. So core protocol funding, currently a couple of larger entities, sometimes centralized around different processes. How can we push the envelope there? And I should have a screenshot of the tweet itself, but yeah, last November, there was, again, this recurring discussion about like, how do core protocol teams get funded? What's the incentives to work on it? And Danny Ryan is another person who works in core development. He basically sketched out what Protocol Guild is in a tweet, and but here are the three main challenges that we settled on as we started to think about this problem. As I touched on before, curation is hard. The incentives to work on the core protocol are imbalanced or sometimes centralized around a couple different actors. And the third challenge we wanted to address is that contributor churn is bad. So I can pause here before I jump into these. Anybody have any questions about like Ethereum public goods, other funding mechanism, things like that? Otherwise, I'll just zoom through these and then we can open it up to broader discussion. All right, I will keep going. So curation is hard. Hopefully these emojis make sense, but the first line is the problem statement. So the ecosystem wants to send money to the core protocol. This is sort of what we've realized, is that people are interested in sponsoring developers. They're interested in funding their dependency graph. The people that make this core infrastructure possible, the developers that are, maybe not pursuing other more lucrative opportunities in order to work on these important public goods. The ecosystem wants to fund the core protocol, but they don't know where to send the money. Or if they do, it's only a small subset of people who are working on the core protocol. Like a couple may have a Gitcoin grant, others may have just an address listed somewhere, but it's really, really hard to find all this information, collate it together, and then everybody's using different reference points. It's challenging to get people to actually fund. So the ecosystem wants to sponsor, but there's no mechanism that they can send to. Simultaneously, protocol contributors are interested in having additional funding streams, exposure to the success of the broader ecosystem, but there's no mechanism for them to plug into. So our response, that second line below, is that we just curate a mechanism for people to send to a single mechanism that has all the people that are doing this important work. So you've got the little developer there who's going to self-curate a contract that says, okay, look, here's the addresses of people who are doing the work. And you can use that. The broader ecosystem can send funding to it. And it's important that the core protocol contributors themselves are the ones curating this list or this contract on chain, because it would be a really tall order to ask the ecosystem itself to, again, get that really deep, intimate context with who's doing the work, how much they should be weighted. It would be pretty much impossible for somebody outside of that context to do the curation. So we thought it was really important that the on-chain mechanism was self-curated and that we could try to make as high signal a mechanism as possible. The second challenge, so you have this is another significant problem, is that layer 2s, DeFi projects, NFT projects, anything with a token or recurring revenue, there's a huge incentive for smart, intelligent people to go work on them as opposed to the core protocol, just in terms of upside. Ethereum doesn't offer the same token incentives that these applications or L2s can. However, it still needs to, for this foreseeable near or medium term, it needs to attract and retain talent in order to continue evolving the protocol, scaling it to where we want to get it eventually. And as the broader ecosystem continues to grow, we can see that competition for talented individuals is only going to increase. This is just I don't want to fault people or think that I am annoyed with the competition for smart minds or anything like that. That's a necessary part of the ecosystem growing. It's reasonable to use financial incentives like this. So I'm not faulting anybody. It's just the reality of the context that we're operating in. And of course, financial motivations aren't the only or best motivator. It's just one tool in our tool set that's under leveraged. So huge incentives to work on these tokenized projects, L2s, maybe smaller incentives to work on the core protocol. The way we can rebalance that a little bit, take a tiny bit of the value that these other projects are creating, and just allow them to forward it on to the people who are working on the core protocol and rebalance the incentives a slight bit. So this isn't going to, it's not going to completely equal if you were to go start a DeFi startup as a founder or join an L2 project to get a token allocation, but it'll at least help to somewhat balance it. So to combat this challenge of imbalance, we want to engage all of these ecosystem players, projects, L2s, in the actual funding of the core protocol. The third challenge was contributor. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, just quickly on that one. I think that's a really cool mechanic, and I talked to a lot of builders in the space, and a lot of them maybe building a protocol or a public good or something, and they're adding little splits into different like fees in their protocol or something that'll just split right over to the protocol guild. And I think that's a really cool mechanic. I think it's a good way for people to like be able to support that public good that is really helping everything else run, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Like any infrastructure you use in your daily life, roads, for example, like you pay taxes, but you don't think actively like, oh, I funded this thing. But it's crucial in order for this thing to continue evolving, to be maintained. This doesn't happen just by people wanting it to happen. It's been really amazing to see people start to pick up on this and understand that they can plug right into this mechanism. So yeah, the final challenge that we wanted to address is that contributor churn is bad. So there's a really steep learning curve when somebody joins working on a new client, for example. It can take 6 to 12 months to really get your hands into the code base, understand the nuances of why certain decisions are made, and then starting to actually contribute meaningfully to a code base. Another challenge is that contributor value grows over time. So if you've been here for 4 years, you're more valuable to the protocol, but there's less incentive for you to stay around once you're an expert, right? And it may be more compelling to go and leave and work on something that has a higher upside. So one thing that we wanted to address this with is that we wanted to include vesting in this. So if there's any large token allocations from projects, we want to make sure that these are vesting over time to help with the knowledge transfer. That's the big part of what we're trying to accomplish, is that the protocol suffers when we have really high churn. So if we can reduce that by having people stick around a little bit longer, train, if they're on their way out, that's totally fine. Like some amount of churn is normal, but you want to make sure that you're transferring the knowledge of these code bases to the next set of people who are working on it. So as is probably clear at this point, I'm describing the protocol guild and how it works, the things we wanted to address. And where we are today is, this is actually outdated. It's, I think, around 125, but it's a collective, or a DAO, if you want to call it that, on-chain of 125-ish Ethereum core protocol contributors. working to rebalance the incentives to work on the core protocol. And as this simple diagram illustrates, sponsors can send money or assets or recurring revenue, pretty much anything besides NFTs, because it eventually goes to a split. They'll send it to this vesting contract for the pilot, it vests for a year, and then it'll go to this weighted registry, which is self-curated. That's the very simple version of how this thing works. We're working on a V2, and we're hoping that it'll use a similar mechanism or a similar architecture, maybe with some additional nice features. But this is roughly how it works. And yeah, I touched on that before, but eligibility is basically currently for the pilot, it's research, people who are trying to spec out where the protocol is going, clients who are implementing any new code for network upgrades, coordination, the people that are engaging with the community, making sure people are aware of what changes are coming, and helping the community itself shape the future of the protocol, and then the tooling that developers use to interact with things like the EVM generally. Actually, small note on that: we are planning to split off tooling just because it's an entire separate, large and diverse user group. So we think that there could be another, the tooling guild or something, because it's just there's so many people there, and it would be hard to curate. And again, we want to keep this ethos of like the people who are curating should be close to the work that's being produced, and tooling is large enough. There's a massive community of people who write libraries, who create interfaces for devs to use. So after the pilot, tooling will probably be split off into its own protocol guild analog. And so eligibility, we usually try to have at least 6 months of contribution before we add somebody to the vesting split. And then, self-curation helps us to avoid dependence on external curating agencies, not agencies, entities. Like I touched on before, Quadratic Funding is the curating entity. However, the broader Ethereum community may not have the best perspective on what at the core protocol is really important or what is crucial work. So we bring that back in-house to the people who are being funded. Similar thing for the EF's ecosystem support program or the Optimism badge holders. They're a couple steps removed from what this work is, and they may not have a perfect perspective into who's doing valuable work. So by bringing the curation back into the people who are being funded, the broader ecosystem can 100% be sure that this is the most accurate signaling mechanism for who's working on the core protocol. And we think this is incentive compatible because, for example, I'm not going to add my cousin or 30 people that are not actually working on the core protocol, because this will dilute existing ones. So there's a bit of a natural tendency for people to want to be aware of curation and who's being added or not being added. However, to balance that out, eligible contributors have to be added in order for this mechanism to maintain legitimacy. So we're not going to add random people. However, you have to add people who are eligible. Otherwise, the ecosystem or the community who's also watching and helping to safeguard this mechanism, they're going to call it out and say, hey, this person is working on a client. Why aren't they part of this? So both of these things hopefully will balance each other out. We'll see if that holds in the wild, especially as we start getting larger and larger sums in here. So yeah, we're in the 6-month mark right now, actually, of a 1-year pilot. So earlier this year, over the summer, let's see, May, June, July, August, around that time, we raised 11 million from a bunch of different DAO treasuries. This includes, I'll give them shout outs here, Lido, ENS, Uniswap, Nouns DAO, Moloch DAO, all leaders in helping us trailblaze what this mechanism can be and where we hope to see it go in the future. So that was earlier this year, and all of these funds are vesting on chain. Can't be clawed back in any way. It goes directly to the membership, and as well we've plugged into existing funding rounds like Gitcoin. However, in the future, in order to scale this up to something that's meaningfully balancing the incentives, we're trying to build a norm around protocols allocating percent of the initial token supply. So whether that's 0.5% or 1% or 2%, we want to start building this norm because we think this is one of the easiest ways for a new protocol to one, signal that public goods funding is important, help to build this meme alongside us, and generally differentiate themselves from other protocols which aren't participating in public goods funding. So we've been fortunate. These are a couple names: Tapioca DAO, True Freeze, Gnosis Safe, Texture Punks is an NFT project, and hopefully in the next year we'll have many more that commit to something like this. Obviously, it'll take time to scale over time to where we want to go, but after the pilot, we're hoping to raise 100 million over 4 years to really start to balance out these incentives towards contributing to the core protocol. But yeah, in the meantime, while the pilot continues, we're going to continue updating the split, curating membership, refining our norms, and making sure we document it all. I guess that's another big thing that we try to do is try to document things. I shared a link to the docs in the chat, and that's probably the best place to stay up to date on what this mechanism is, where we're going, or at least understand the structure and the scaffold of it. So I think that's my last slide. We do have an on-chain dashboard, Dune Analytics. I'd have to get the handle again, but I can share the link in the chat in a minute. But so yeah, you can see everybody who's a member, or at least their address, total funding that's gone through it, and yeah, I think this is again a cool part of how we can push the transparency, push on-chain core protocol funding to the next level. And yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's super interesting. I remember back a few years ago, there was like talk of adding in, something in the gas fees that would directly like be funneled over into public goods funds and things like that. But that was ultimately shot down. But it's interesting to see how something similar is kind of at a grassroots level has kind of built up. More with the agency on the people that use the space to realize that it does take research and development and time and major dev skills to maintain the infrastructure that we use every day.
Yeah, I'd love to have Tim jump in here, but I think one of the key differences is that this is completely opt-in, whereas I don't know which if it was an EIP you're referring to or which specific proposal, but yeah, I think it would have been you'd have to do it by default, and this is totally opt-in by the ecosystem. We don't want to coerce anybody into forcing to donate to this thing, and that's also like it puts the onus on the people funding or the people doing the work at the core protocol level to demonstrate their worth, and you can't really lock yourselves in as the beneficiary who's just gonna be locked into this governance position. There's no default, I guess is how I would summarize it.
There's no default like protocol guild. So could someone else start another one and kind of compete and say like we're doing better work at the protocol level?
For sure. Yeah. If you had, for example, if you had something hard coded, like some protocols have a block reward that goes to their foundation. For now they might be doing great work, but who's to say in 10 years they're going to be still doing good work? It hasn't been captured in some way, and Ethereum basically wasn't willing to. They had to pre-mine, obviously back in the day, to fund the Ethereum Foundation at the start, but there's no ongoing or recurring funding that the protocol gives. So yeah, it's definitely harder in the sense that you don't have something to depend on, but in reality, I think this is the approach that's better long term in that you avoid capture scenarios. Obviously, there's this social aspect of like the weight of all the core protocol developers are currently on this mechanism. How hard is it to shift to another one? But yeah, it's a. I'm excited about this way of experimenting. But yeah, Tim, if you want to jump in or have any additional perspective there on whether funding should be opt-in.
Yeah. So I guess for me, the biggest reason to not have it at the protocol level is you want the protocol to just be like a neutral piece of infrastructure. And when I think of like, the block reward, it should basically just pay for security, right? Like the reason we have this in the first place is, we need to pay validators to do the work of maintaining the network. And I think there's like a lot of value from just the protocol design perspective of saying, this is what this thing pays for. And, if we say we realize that like it was way too high or way too low, like we can have a conversation as a community, like, should we raise validator rewards because they're too low, or should we lower them because they're too high? But if you start to like bundle things together, then it's like much harder because you're not, you're making that debate much more complicated, because you don't just have to agree like, oh, are validators paid or underpaid, but like, oh, well, if we lower the validator rewards, then like we're gonna lower how much protocol guild gets. And that's like, it just becomes like really hard to reason about, and it makes it like a less neutral mechanism. I think the other bit is just like, it's really hard to identify what's the valuable work. So if you look at this EIP that was proposed, to add some block reward funding for a bunch of stuff in 2018, honestly, today, like half of those things would have been a waste of money. Like some of them would have been fine. The other half would have been literally burning money. And the ones that were good ended up getting funding otherwise. So I'm like, just even if like we were fine with putting in protocol funds to go to specific initiatives, I think that like feedback loops with like how quickly the protocol moves versus how well you can like or how quickly the actual work we need to do changes is really hard to get right. And then the third thing is like, if you have it off chain, it does create the opportunity for competition, which is really healthy, and also for people to like step away from it. So imagine, if we have protocol guild today and people like it, that's great. But if we do something terrible in a year, people can just go on Twitter and complain about it, and that'll like stop people from donating to Protocol Guild in the future. Or there might be like a better one, right? Like, somebody creates a better version of Protocol Guild, all the client devs say, oh, use that instead. That's like, it's really healthy that this can happen, and it's not like entrenched there. And then, if you try to just deploy a random smart contract today and say, this is Protocol Guild, and none of the actual devs are in it, then the devs can just say, no, this is not. And so I don't think the like potential for spam is that high if it's not part of the core protocol.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I'm trying to imagine the situation where the core devs kind of fork off into a different mechanic. Is there something there where like the fees can, or the current treasury that is being invested and streamed could be like transferred to a different mechanic if there was enough buy-in by core devs, or would it be
No, but that's a feature, not a bug. Because like you would have to move future donations there. And the reason is like, if you give them if you give them the ability to transfer the treasury, one, there's like a risk of a hack, right? That, what if you just steal the treasury? And two, I think one thing that's really important for like the donors to Protocol Guild is you want it to be like a really strong commitment, right? Like you don't want, I don't know, say Uniswap to say, we're going to give $10 million, and then they send $1 million, they get a bunch of press, and then they back out, right? So having the smart contract, like having them kind of be forced by virtue of sending to the smart contract to have the whole amount there invest, I think is a really important property. But it does mean that if core devs wanted to move to something else, they couldn't move what exists there, but they could move the next version, which is actually, and Trent, maybe you can talk about this, but this is actually exactly how we're doing to upgrade Protocol Guild, right? When we have a version live now, we're going to move to a longer version. And this is basically this process where we're going to just tell people, look, this is the old version, use the new version instead. Trent, do you want to maybe explain like how that works?
The upgrade process, or?
Yeah, because the upgrade process is basically the same thing as, competing with Protocol Guild, but just like internally.
Sure. So if that's interesting. So if we're lucky, we'll be able to use the same architecture. We use 0x splits under the hood. So that's a splits protocol that is, we've worked with them. They're a great team. I highly recommend everybody go check it out, experiment, figure out if it works for your use case. But we worked with them early in the year, this year, to create a vesting contract that plugs in directly to the splits protocol itself. And so what we will have to do is convince people to donate or send their contributions to the next vesting contract. So right now the pilot is 1 year. In the future it will be 4. Maybe someday we'll get to 10 years if it's significant enough. But there is some coordination that we do have to push people towards, saying, look, this is the new contract. You will have to donate here. This is assuming that everything with the way we're designing the V2 works out, and we won't have to migrate to a completely new feature set. But that's basically it. There is some social consensus around, okay, is this still the contract we want to be donating to? There's no default that people are always going to be using. And shout out again to Deacon and earlier a couple other people in the Moloch community have been providing feedback, but Deacon's looking into some ways that we can sort of design this middleware shaman contract that'll plug into a Moloch DAO and sort of string together a Moloch and the splits contract itself. So we appreciate your work, and it's super exciting just talking about this stuff, seeing where we can take these contracts.
Yeah, I love this kind of stuff, and it's interesting the way you guys you want to use the Moloch. It's not necessary for the governance side because you're as governance minimized as you can be. But there is kind of this curation aspect of bringing on new members, and I guess that's really it. And so right now, to boost the resiliency of the DAO or of the guild in general is to remove any kind of delegated group, which is controlling it now, and have it more managed at a DAO level. I think that's really interesting. If anyone has any questions or would like to make a point or anything like that, go ahead and
please, or just generally about just generally about what are people's thoughts on how the core protocol should be funded? Is it just the Ethereum Foundation's responsibility? Do we need on-chain mechanisms for core protocol funding? Is it okay that all of it happens off-chain? This is open time to ask those questions.
Yeah, I've definitely heard some different takes in general on this. If anyone would like to comment, I think Sky and Travis have mentioned things to me before in the past, but one of the things I was thinking about while you were talking about it. Oh, was someone saying something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you could elucidate a little bit on how the curation does work right now, as far as adding new members or getting into that registry, I think you called it, and being removed from it, I guess.
Sure. So generally, I guess I won't give you the actual mechanics of how we add the process, but generally somebody will come, an existing member. So it's always from an existing member. At least to date, I guess somebody could come and propose themselves, but given how the flow works now, we have this private GitHub where somebody will propose a change to an existing list of people. They'll give a short blurb about, okay, this person, I know them for 2 years. I've been working with them on this client team, or they just joined my team. They've been here 6 months at least. Here's the work that they're doing. I think that it's really valuable. They're planning on sticking around. They're not going to dip it, so we don't waste coordination time talking about somebody who's just going to leave. Just a general description of what the person is doing and why they think they should be added. And it's usually pretty cut and dry. Just if somebody is working on a client, if they're a researcher, we want to scope the eligibility to be as explicit as possible. So there's no we don't have to have these huge arguments about oh, is this person actually contributing? Should they actually be, what's the gray area? We want to minimize as many gray area discussions as possible. So we've tried to write out what the eligibility requirements are in the docs, and this has been like a really back and forth process between the membership just the membership amongst itself, talking about who should be eligible, how we should frame it. But once you've made this general proposal, you have discussion for a week, and then people generally agree that, okay, yes, this person should be eligible. And in the current architecture, we're updating the split every quarter. So, we'll accrue this backlog of people who need to be added or removed, and then every quarter we update the split. In the future, hopefully we can bring this all on chain, but right now it happens off chain, and then we'll sort of pull in this CSV of addresses and weights, and then put it into the split contract itself. But yeah, it's a pretty straightforward process, and yeah, I guess does that answer the question?
Yep, yeah, perfectly actually. So it is. So
I mean,
the end output is.
Sorry, please.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so the end output basically is like a list of addresses and weights. So when you get added to the registry, you get added with the weight as well. I was going to ask about weighting.
Yep, exactly. I can touch on that quick before Tim jumps in. The weighting is kind of in keeping with the overall philosophy of governance is hard. We should try and limit the number of like dials and levers that governance has to control, because it ends up creating overhead. You have to decide what things should be up to governance, how they should be controlled. Sort of it opens a whole can of worms that we want to avoid as long as possible. So for example, in weighting, we wanted to again remove places where contention could come up. So weighting is determined just by how long you've been contributing to the protocol. So somebody who's been here 2 years gets roughly twice the weight of somebody who has been here 1 year. And the key thing that we add is a square root on all of this. So over time, everyone's weights will trend towards being roughly equal. And that way, because we're using time and just a time weighting, basically, we don't have to worry about, okay, did Tim release one more blog post than Trent? How much is that weighted? What is the qualitative weight of this contribution? Or like going through people's GitHub edits, stuff like that. It gets really, really messy and really complicated really fast. Now, of course, this this misses out on a lot of granularity. There are, objectively people who are more important to the protocol evolution than others. But in the interest of, governance minimization, giving people the time to focus on this important protocol work instead of governing this mechanism, we opted for a time-based mechanism, and it's working out so far. Like, we don't have to. The only times we've had discussion is like, okay, should the weighting function have a square root or not a square root? That's kind of what the furthest discussion has come to. But we avoid this whole manual process of figuring out what each person's weight is every time we need to add them. It's just like, okay, when did you start? All right, it goes into, that's your start date. And that, yeah. Tim, you can jump in here.
Yeah, I was going to say, and even with that simple approach, you still get like some weird edge cases. And so this is kind of why we think it's important to like slowly roll out and, have this pilot and figure out like, what are the edge cases we hit upon, so that like, we kind of build this like institutional knowledge that like, oh, we had this case and this is how we ended up dealing with it. Just as an example, I proposed somebody for Protocol Guild the last week or 2 weeks ago, and they worked on Ethereum mostly. They still work on Ethereum mostly, but then over their career, they had times where like they worked on different stuff and different protocols. So we had to like have the conversation of like, okay, which bits of this are eligible, which ones aren't, and it's like, having these conversations is really helpful, because once we have that person as an example, then we can kind of point to them as an example when the stake are 10 times higher, right? Like now there's about $10 million in Protocol Guild, and there's money at stake, but it's kind of easier to reason about these exceptions. But if we never had these edge cases and, there's like $10 billion in Protocol Guild, the stakes are so high that like it becomes really, really hard to have these conversations. So I think, yeah, that's something I'm personally kind of happy about, is just kind of slowly building things out so that we test all the weird edge cases and like grow our confidence around how this can be managed.
Yeah, super cool. Thanks.
One of the things I've
time value is super simple and elegant. I like that.
Yeah, one of the things I've wondered about open protocol development is, I mean, you're going to have full-time people working on it, and then really the people that are kind of maybe building on top of it, but they're aligned to keep it working, and it's open source, and because of what they're building. Do you guys see like a division like that between full-time, part-time people, or people that are working on something else but are using the protocol but are trying to add to the protocol at the same time? Is that common, or is it really just like a bunch of people that are full-time working on the protocol?
Much more full-time, and even like the part-time people, we call it part weight. It's still like to a large extent their main thing. I think we want, like, the bar has to be still kind of high, and you can think of this, think of it as like almost like if you have like shares vesting for a startup, right? Like you might give shares to some part-time employees, and you change their vesting schedule. But like some contractor who comes in and works, on something for a month probably won't get like shares. And I think this is like roughly the view that we have. Where like, if somebody is making big contributions to Ethereum on a pretty regular basis, at the protocol level, they should probably be in, regardless of like what their actual employment status is. But if somebody comes in, just writes an EIP, like a single EIP champion, I think our view is just like that's not enough of like a sustained contribution to be part of Protocol Guild. But that said, if you write, 10 EIPs over the course of like 5 years, then like maybe that does become like a good case of like someone who's part-time and like constantly contributing to the protocol. And that's kind of why we also have this like 6 months gap where we want to wait and see, what have people done and what do we expect them to do going forward? Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. If you think of it like working on road infrastructure or something. So is it a like the road team that's just building the road and continuing to fix potholes and stuff? Or are the people driving on the road, are they incentivized to fix a pothole just because they don't want to drive over it?
In practice, they don't fix it. I mean, both for actual roads and for Ethereum, like I think the experience is like, there's definitely a different class of people who like spend their time fixing the roads versus using it. Yeah.
And that's not to say like people, we don't want to encourage this or like there should be an open posture, but kind of what we touched on earlier about it takes time to get up to speed on what some of these client code bases are. People may not have the context to know exactly. I mean, it's like with any open source project, somebody wants to contribute, but they don't necessarily have the full context of how something needs to be architected or specific considerations for other bits of the code base. So people might have the intention, but it's really hard sometimes to plug into that. And actually,
I could also see it being a potential angle of capture. Everyone has different incentives for using a protocol, and if you're building something on top, your incentives might not align with everyone else. So it might be important to keep that kind of third party that isn't necessarily fixing the road with maglev in that spot because they build maglev cars or whatever.
Right, exactly. And then I guess like more generally, if you step back.
So the point is that like if you're building on it, and you're making money on it, then just give some money to this core team. It also seems like just whales in general would want to donate to this to continue development. Is that something you're seeing, or are you really leaning on like new protocols
Yeah,
or
it'll
are
be.
there?
It'll end up being a mix of funders. So in one of the slides, I had a reference to Open Grants, which was funded by an individual. I think like 4,000 ETH went into it. Similar vesting to some core contributors who were working on what was called ETH2 at the time. Obviously, it's just Ethereum, we call it today. But that was one of the original vesting protocols, and sponsored directly by an individual. There was also, there's currently one larger contributor who gives directly to Protocol Guild. And this isn't to say like they shouldn't, but yeah, it will. The large majority of contributions are like the success of this will come from a wide range of people contributing. So individuals, for example, like Gitcoin rounds, partnering with larger institutions to do matching pools. It will be protocols donating recurring revenue. It will be initial percents of token allocations, things like that. It will be stakers who are receiving recurring funding for the work that they're doing, forwarding on a portion of transaction fees or the ETH that they're actually getting from doing validation services. We hope that it'll be a really wide range, a diversified pool of funding that's coming in.
So very cool, and an interesting compensation mechanic in general. That it doesn't have to be this like huge protocol guild. I think even maybe smaller treasuries and smaller DAOs, this time weighting mechanic is something interesting. So it's even on that level, it's a good experiment, to see how this stuff works. Anyone else have any questions? We're going to wrap this one up pretty quick. If you do, I think you can just unmute yourself, or you can leave a message in the chat. Let me check up there and see if we got anything. One question. Where's the panel coming? Oh, okay. Well, we can go into that. Does anyone have any questions real quick?
All right. Yeah, if we're wrapping up, I'll just say, if anybody's interested in engaging with this, they have questions about the architecture, they have questions about how we do eligibility, what this thing is, how they can help. If they're interested in fundraising, anything and everything, just reach out to either Tim or myself, because we're in basically the opening stretch of building the norms around this mechanism. We think it has a lot of potential to scale to something really, really significant in the future. Think of it like it is an on-chain foundation that's stewarding the protocol long term. That's kind of where we're aiming for this to go, and really hope that people will start to poke at it, engage with it, ask us tough questions, figure out how we can scale this up, because it's not going to be it's not going to get to where we want it to go unless the broader community is engaged. And that's not to say we haven't seen these sort of questions and people getting excited about it as well. Really fortunate to have the beginnings of the community helping us work on this, but the more the merrier, and we'd love to have you join us, help to build this project. And thank you also for the time to present and talk to people. We're really glad to be here today.